Let me introduce you to my grandpa, Gerald Black, who is a former member of the United States Navy. Let's backtrack a little. Gerald grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, where he spent his early life farming and milking cows. When he got to the end of his senior year in high school, he decided that he wasn't ready for college, but he wanted to do something.
In 1961, I joined the Navy. I knew I didn't want to go in the Army, and I knew I didn't want to go in the Marine Corps. The Air Force was full up, and I didn't like being on water because it got me seasick. So I joined the United States Submarine Service, part of the U.S. Navy. I went back to school on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., then on up to New London, Connecticut for submarine school. In 1963, I moved on out to San Diego and got to my first submarine, which was called the USS Segundo.
When Gerald joined the Navy, he was entering it while the Vietnam War was going on. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. was developing different armaments in order to make us a world power. The Vietnam War was a Cold War conflict due to its direct conflict on communism. By the end of it, the Vietnam War ended up changing our perspectives of many things, which included being captured.
The Korean War and the beginning of the Vietnam War changed the whole concept of what we were trained in case you were captured. You know, it used to be that if you were captured, you gave your name, rank, and serial number. That's all you were supposed to give, and they could torture you and so on. But I think if we remember, if we've learned anything, is that if somebody's going to torture you, they already know the answers. They just want to break you.
Many people enlisted in the Vietnam War despite the consequences. Gerald was among those people who enlisted without a doubt, where many people tried to avoid being drafted. People would leave the country and go to Canada, they would get married and have children, or go to college, whatever it took. But Gerald had no regret about joining the Navy. He wanted to leave home, and he had a relative that was in the war long before him, which gave him the courage to join.
And I'm named after my uncle Gerald, who went to war in World War II. And he arrived in Germany and went, as the story is told to me, he went into the mess hall to get something to eat on his first day there. And he come walking out of the mess tent and he got killed by a German sniper. So I never got to meet my uncle, who I'm named after, but he was a good-looking guy.
Despite the sad war story of his uncle, Gerald joined the Navy. His submarine, the USS Segundo, was 300 feet long, which was half the size of the nuclear submarines, which we all know as the Hollywood submarines.
Our submarine was run on engines, diesel engines, and that's what our power was. And then one of the engines would take and make charge batteries for us, and we could have lights and so on for when we're underwater, because it's pretty hard to run an engine underwater. But a nuclear submarine is basically a steam engine. It takes nuclear power that heats water and makes steam. Steam is the propulsion in nuclear power. And of all of the energies in the world today, I don't think that anybody has ever figured out how powerful steam is. They've never built a contraption to hold it. So it's very powerful indeed.
The USS Segundo could stay underwater for only a couple hours at a time because it didn't have a way to make oxygen, so what was on board was all you had. They would have to come up to snorkel depth and put a big valve up in order to bring air into the submarine while they were underwater, where in contrast, nuclear submarines could stay out to sea for 5 years.
Oh, yeah, when you'd come up and you weren't used to fresh air, so you'd get sick almost because the air was so wonderful. I remember we would have movies on board. They were old 16 millimeter, you know, the old film. And we would get new movies that weren't even released yet because we were submarines, and they would do that for the military, the movie world. And we would watch a movie forward and forward and forward. And if you're out and you're gone from port for like 3 months, we'd go to the Philippines, into Hong Kong, into Japan, and Guam, and so on, in the Pacific. And we would watch movies at night. I remember I watched one movie. I watched it forward, I kept track of it, it was 12 times. We watched it backwards 3 times. And it was, you get to quote every line in the movie, but it was fun to do it because you got something to see, and there isn't a lot to do on a submarine.
In addition to watching a lot of movies on board, they had a lot of different food options. Fresh produce would last about 2 weeks, and then you would get into the canned and freezer foods. They had lobster, steak, and hamburgers. To his surprise, the USS Segundo had some of the best chefs and bakers in the world.
Yes, our bakers and our cooks were sent to the great five-star hotels in the country to learn how to make something really, really taste good and make it look good. So we had bakers that were trained in the New York by chefs, and they would come back. So we had cream puffs at 60 feet underwater. That was great.
Food and movies kept the crew entertained, but when they weren't doing that, they had to work. Gerald enjoyed typing, so he became a yeoman. A yeoman takes care of officer records and secure things that are top secret. Gerald had to maintain all the records of all the enlisted officers on board and type up all the operations reports of where they went and what they were doing underwater, as well as the contacts they made.
It's an amazing thing. We had 88 men on board a submarine that I was on. My serial number is 5914439, 7 digits. I knew everybody's serial number, service number, by heart, 88 of them. I knew everybody's first name, last name, and their middle name. I knew everybody's brothers and sisters. I knew what city they came from and what state. I knew, in most cases, even what their parents' names were. I dealt with that information every day, all day long. Sometimes my days went 27, 28 hours.
With all the typing that Gerald had to do, as well as everything going on in the control rooms, the submarines had to have the best technology. However, the top-of-the-line technology does not even compare to what we have now.
Hand me your phone, Peyton. This phone right here has more computing power than we had on our fleet ballistic missile submarines. In the computer room, a computer that wasn't even close to this powerful was approximately 7 feet tall, 2 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and there was usually 10 to 12 of those stacked up. Couldn't do what this does.
All the technology was provided by President Kennedy, who was in Gerald's mind their friend, who was on their side making sure they had everything they needed. The military ties to Kennedy made his death the saddest moment for Gerald in the submarine service.
November 23rd, I was underwater. We were at periscope depth and the radio had just come on and we got news, and President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. And I don't think there was a dry eye on the submarine that our president was killed. That was a sad time. So I remember him fondly to this day. No man is perfect, but he tried to do good things.
Thinking back on the war now, Gerald talked about what his impression of the Cold War is after everything he experienced in the Navy.
The Cold War is not a war of bullets. It's a war of the mind. It's about greed, it's about selfishness, it's about power, it's about politicians being politicians, thinking they know what's best for us and we don't. And we know that's really not the case. So the Cold War will continue to be fought, I suppose, forever at some level.